Hello, and welcome to today's RevCycleIntelligence.com presentation brought to you by Imagine Solutions. Debunking the myth of outsourced coding, how BJC changes coding paradigm and achieves superior results. This is Kyle Murphy, Director of Editorial at Xtelligent Media and moderator of today's webcast. We will begin with a presentation by our speakers and conclude with a question and answer segment. Audience members are free to submit questions at any time during the presentation using the question tool to the left of their screens. For all technical matters or difficulties, click the Help icon at the top right-hand corner of the screen. A copy of today's presentation's materials is available under Event Resources to the left of your screens as well. Today we are pleased to welcome Tracey Berry, Vice President of Revenue Cycle Management at BJC Healthcare, where she also oversees the Sorian Revenue Cycle Technology Project and the ICD10 Project Management Office, as well as manages a team of 650 employees. And we also welcome Michael DeMarco, Chief Executive Officer at Imagine Solutions, the largest outsourced provider of HIM professionals in the U.S. Before joining Imagine, Michael served as the CEO of the Outsourced Group for over 9 years prior to its successful acquisition in 2013. At this time, I would like to hand things over to Michael to begin today's presentation.
Thanks, Kyle, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. The purpose of the discussion today is really to talk about various market drivers that are impacting the outsourced coding market and to explore some innovative approaches to addressing some of those particular issues. Fundamentally, the supply of coders in the United States is not keeping pace with the demand for services. And as we look at that over a period of time, we see that particular issue worsening, not getting better. The general demographics of the coder population is unfavorable to this demand curve in that the average age of coders in the U.S., some 48% are over the age or between the ages of 45 and 64, and many of those are retiring out. And there's not enough new coders being produced to handle really the higher level, the higher acuity type coding performed by or required by healthcare organizations in the U.S. When you look at the demand drivers for healthcare services, you've got, in addition to Affordable Care Act, expansion of Medicaid services, we've got an aging population. All the baby boomers, folks like myself who are aging out and using the healthcare system more frequently now than ever before. According to CMS, back in 2010, there were 40 million Americans over the age of 65. Every day in the U.S., 10,000 people reach the age or celebrate their 65th birthday, and the projection is that by 2020, the number of folks in the U.S. over 65 will be 54 million. So the number just continues to grow. So as healthcare services, as more people have access to the healthcare system increases, obviously the need for coding more charts. And the more charts need to be coded, the more coders we need, and the coding population, again, is not keeping pace with that demand. Exacerbating all this has been the transition to ICD10. And, I think when we first started talking about ICD-10, and really got serious about this most recent and the live conversion last year, people were speculating on, what the impact was going to be, and the big questions were, how is productivity going to be impacted, and how long was it going to take to recover and get back to the new normal? What would the new normal be? A lot of projections were catastrophic. Productivity is going to drop 40-50%. I think the consensus would be that, overall, the recovery was a lot faster than what people predicted. The impact of productivity has really been, somewhere probably between the 12 to 20% range. Some coder types haven't been impacted at all. We see a lot on the pro-fee side and the ED side where productivity recovered very quickly and got back to the ICD-9 levels. But we still see in the complex outpatient world and the inpatient world where productivity levels, are really kind of anywhere between, 80 to 88% of the ICD-9 level. So still a sustainable decline in productivity, but not nearly as bad as it was predicted to be. So that's the good news of the story. However, the demand for coding jobs continues to be very strong, and according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they're predicting a 15% growth in coding jobs compared to national job growth averages of about 7%, so twice what we're seeing in the rest of the economy. So again, points to the need for more coders to be produced in the U.S. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tracy for some of her comments, but that was really meant to form the backdrop for kind of the situation that's occurring in the U.S. You're all kind of challenged by the same issues, trying to find the right number of coders, more importantly, finding qualified coders who produce quality charts and meet productivity levels, and doing that at a cost that makes sense for your organization.
So thanks, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. I would say our experience at BJC is similar to what you described, Michael. Luckily, I would say our average age of our coders is a little bit lower than what you described. Our average age is closer to 48 years. But we've also done a lot of hiring. I had that number from about 4 or 5 years ago, and I think the average age was about 56. So we've done a lot of training programs where we've brought in inexperienced coders, and we've been training them up. So I think by all the hiring we've done, we've seen that change a little bit. But we certainly, have the same concern about availability of coders. Our average coder has been here 8.5 years. And again, I think that would have looked a little different several years ago because we've done so much hiring. As far as productivity, boy, you're exactly right. It really has varied by type. And so those areas, those really, what I'll say, the easy outpatients, we saw quite a decline. That's probably the biggest area we saw a decline, and we believe that's because in those areas, coders largely had codes memorized. So they weren't even having to use the coding pathways, so they were really fast. So ICD-10, even though you'd think, well, gosh, those easier, quote, easier outpatients, you wouldn't see such a productivity decline, but we think because so many codes were memorized. On the other hand, we made a switch at BJC that in our outpatient procedures, we used to code both the CPT code as well as the I-9 code, and when we moved to ICD-10, we stopped doing the procedure code in I-10. So we actually got a productivity pickup because we weren't kind of dual coding, if you will, those procedures. So the point is, I agree with you that it's been pretty varied. In our inpatient areas, we saw more like a 15, 17% decline. We saw a bigger decline, though, that you're mentioning in ED. Our ED, maybe it's some of that same, kind of memorizing kinds of stuff. So, again, all over the board, but certainly not nearly as, I think when we all looked back to, 2 years ago, we were very fearful of that 40 or 50% productivity decline, and we haven't seen that.
And I think, some of that goes to, I think what we've seen across the board with our clients is it's kind of the level of readiness. When did they start preparing for ICD-10? Where did they focus their effort? And I think, the organizations that did more training, more dual coding, and started earlier were able to cover more chart type, coder types, if you will, than the ones who started later. The ones who started later focused a lot on the inpatient world because that's where the biggest potential financial impact could be, and maybe spent less time on the ED and the prophy side. So we saw some of those clients suffer more on the ED and prophy side than other people. So I think a lot of it was driven by it's kind of level of readiness, how well, how long in advance did you prepare, what was the level of preparedness, as well as what's the complexity in the organization. And with BJC, you've got kind of everything across the board from very high end academic inpatient to community-based hospitals. So I think that was one of the other kind of things that we've noted along the way. But kind of moving on through the discussion, one of the things that we've noted as we kind of continue to work in the healthcare space is that the traditional model used for healthcare coding is really suboptimal, and it becomes more suboptimal as things progress through ICD-10, through the expansion of healthcare services. And what I mean very specifically is when we would talk to our clients, One of the things that was fairly consistent is our clients use multiple vendors. And when they use multiple vendors and they place that phone call at any given point in time to say, I need 5 inpatient coders, they put the word out to all of their vendors. All of their vendors then go out to the marketplace to try to recruit people because they don't have people just sitting waiting for a job. They're not sitting there paying them while they're not productive. So they all go to the same marketplace looking to recruit the same people to bring them in. When they do, it's a race to who can get them there first. So they toss them over the fence and, in essence, hope they're successful. As a result of that, the productivity and quality get impacted because there's really no preparation. The vendors are unwilling to make a commitment to upfront learning, knowledge transfer, training, and auditing of those coders because they don't know how long that coder is going to be employed. And if that coder is there for a very short period of time, a bubble, that's going to last 30, 60, 90 days, they're reluctant to make a big financial investment because there's not enough longevity to the revenue stream. What that translates into is those coders being ill-prepared. They come in, they don't hit productivity ramp very quickly, quality is an issue, so the hospital has to turn its internal resources towards really managing the outsourced coders, which is counterproductive to what they were trying to accomplish in the first place. So that's kind of the dynamic that we've seen in the market. When we talk to our clients and ask that question, and this came through 2 sources. Imagine did a benchmark survey earlier or later last year, towards the latter part of last year, as well as Advance for Health Information Professionals. So 2 different surveys, and the emphasis on quality and productivity not meeting expectations was really pronounced. It was, in fact, the biggest issue across the healthcare providers' canvas. And, the quality of coders was rated, kind of the biggest issue at 34%. There were some other issues in there kind of, tangentially related to that, which are, the amount of time it takes to onboard, the quality of the auditing, availability of resources, ICD10 readiness, et cetera. So there were some other factors like that that were noted by hospitals that were canvassed during these surveys.
So a little perspective from BJC perhaps, and for those of you who may not be as familiar with BJC, we're located in St. Louis. Our hospitals are in Illinois and Missouri. We've got 12 hospitals, and our revenues are about $4 billion. And our hospitals range from critical access hospitals, rural critical access, to to our academic medical center, Barnes-Jewish Hospital, our St. Louis Children's Hospital Pediatric Center. So we have, and everything in between, so a lot of big community centers. Our coding team at BJC has about 200 FTEs, and that would be coders, QA, training, folks that do editing, that resolve coding edits for billing, our management staff and the like. So we got about 200 FTEs in coding, but another 60 FTEs in contract coders. So just to give you an idea of kind of our scale. And what we were faced with is that we were outsourcing, as about 25% of our coding needs. This was kind of well before ICD10, and we were using anywhere from 7 to 9 vendors, kind of depend on the hospital. And we did have a standard contract and standard rates, so we were taking advantage of our size and scale to do our contracting, and we were doing that like a system, but we were still using all of these different vendors across the organization, and that made it very tricky to manage this work. So as we were preparing for ICD-10, we started really thinking about, what did we want to do different? And the reason we were doing that is that even though our vendors, and many of these vendors had been with us a long time, we weren't necessarily unhappy with them, but we were spending so much time reviewing quality. We had to manage the turnover and productivity, and so we didn't, each of those 7, or, let's say we had 7 primary vendors, they each had a slightly different way that they monitored productivity or quality. We weren't really working with them to project or predict the needs that we were going to have post-ICD-10. We were doing exactly what Michael discussed, which is when we needed coders, we called, or when they had extra coders, they called us and said, hey, do you need somebody? We've got this great coder. So it was, we just weren't planning the way we wanted to. And I would say one of the biggest challenges we had was really around onboarding those coders. So we had our coding management staff at any time, those 60, I don't know, in those days it was probably closer to 45 maybe coders. Every time we had a turnover, we had to onboard that coder. We had to show them the BJC way, if you will. And I will admit that the BJC way isn't always one way. It might be one way at a community hospital, a different way at an academic hospital, a different way at a pediatric hospital. So it was very challenging to bring those coders in and keep them productive. The other thing that we found, I think, in that model was that while our vendors were responsive to our needs and they were most anxious to provide us coders, if there were problems, whether it be quality or productivity or some sort of billing issue, we were taking that issue to them and they were resolving it, trying to resolve it. They weren't bringing us issues. It was kind of a one-way street. So it was a different kind of, I think, just again, what Michael described as kind of the model that we were living in. So because of that, we really kind of identified when we decided we were going to go about this in a new and different way and started our planning process. And so we were trying to overcome several challenges, right? The first is that while we do have a centralized kind of recruiting, and we're a pretty big organization, so we have a good talent acquisition team, we can't recruit outside of Illinois and Missouri. That's where our hospitals are located, and for lots of insurance and workers' comp and all kinds of good reasons, we can't hire coders outside those. So even when we have a great coder who moves to Wisconsin, we can't hang on to them, even though they all work remote. So we have that challenge to overcome. Like I said, we've got our we've got recruiting resources at BJC, and we've got, again, I talked about that team of 200. But nonetheless, when if you've got 25-30% of your workforce that's not part of the family, so to speak, that training is really challenging in the way to manage that. And our management resources, we're really staffed to manage our employees. So we've got, like most everyone, we've got ratios of sort of manager to staff. Well, what we found is that our leaders were fundamentally managing twice as many people as it sort of looked like on paper, because they were managing these additional, they were managing 30% more staff. So that was a challenge. And then, of course, we wanted to, again, from a financially, the best financial decisions. Now, I will say, we didn't necessarily, Michael will be glad to know, we didn't actually start this thinking we were going to save buckets of money, particularly before
Wish I knew that in advance.
Particularly before ICD10, we knew that resources were going to be scarce, but we wanted to make the best financial decisions and have the right economics between both of us. So that's really what we were trying to overcome when we started down this path.
Yeah, and what Tracy mentioned in terms of some of the constraints, around geography and the scalability of the resources, and a really good point around just the span of control of management resources. When you really think about those outsourced coders, they're just like your employees too. They're all working remote, and they need that level of management. And if the vendor isn't providing that, that could be really challenging. So that's a really kind of insightful comment. I would add to all of that is that, as the largest provider of HIM coding outsourcing in the U.S., and we have over 1,200 coders out there working on behalf of our clients, even we are challenged with finding people. And so I translate that back to a hospital that doesn't have nearly the infrastructure that we've devoted, because that's the business we're in. That's not the business you're in. Even we are challenged, and we have some 23-plus people between sourcers and recruiters out hitting the market every day. We average 1,600 outbound calls a week, and for every 100 people we talk to, we only hire one. It's kind of a crazy number, so you've got to really be out there just hammering it every single day. Those 100 people result in about 8 people that get interviewed, and from there we put them through a fairly rigorous skills assessment, which is online testing. It's timed, it's got content. They then follow up with structured interviews, with phone assessments, et cetera. So we, kind of whittle that number down to only, 1% of the people that we actually make a connection with are eligible to be hired by our company. So it's really, creates quite the challenge. The other thing, that we look at and we talk to our clients about is what is the true cost of outsourcing versus an internal coder. And, at some level within the organization, people are concerned about the overall cost, and as Tracy is in her role. And, when you really look at comparing the hourly rate that's paid to a coder internally at the hospital versus what the true cost is, it's very different. And so when comparing it to the cost of an outsourced coder, we really should be looking at it on an apples-to-apples basis. And the first place we start is, well, what's the amount of productive time an employed coder really spends between holidays and, vacation and sick time and time that they spend in meetings, other things that take them away from the actual coding of charts. We've estimated that they're really productive about 83% of the time. When you then layer on the cost of benefits and QA, cost of recruiting, other overhead infrastructure costs, what looks like we used a $23, average pay rate, really looks more like $55 an hour. So while there's still a gap, and I'm not arguing that there isn't, and of course it's less expensive for you to hire your own versus using a contract labor, the only point of this is the gap isn't quite as big or as severe as it might appear. And when you factor in Tracy's other comment about just the management span of control, if you're not able to hire more managers to compensate for those additional resources, you're suboptimizing the management of those resources as well. So I think those are kind of some of the points that we look at when we evaluate the best way to approach this. And so we always ask the question, is there a better way? And, we believe there is.
Michael, I would just add a couple things as we go into this next slide, but is kind of the thing that you were talking about in recruiting. We are much more successful recruiting in inexperienced coders. And so we're working on a career ladder, and so we're doing a better job of bringing in, those more entry-level coders and kind of working them up the ladder, if you will. But at our very complex academic medical center, I don't think we had hired an inpatient coder from the outside in several years. And so I think that I appreciate your coding funnel there, because I think that is really true in order to find the right skill set to get into those roles.
Yeah.
And and I would on the cost of this, I mean, gosh, certainly I'd love to have. I don't know that I would ever want 100% of my coders internal, because I always want some flex, but that, sort of thinking about the cost in terms of the true cost, and I think it's easy to say, gosh, I pay, in Michael's example, $23 an hour, and my contractor is, a multiple of that. But really understanding that it's, that's really not an apples-to-apples comparison. It sort of helped me, especially knowing that I'm using, at any one time, 60 FTEs.
Yeah.
It's real money for sure.
Yeah, and your challenge of trying to find those inpatient coders and even the complex outpatient coders, you're not alone, right? Because they're, ever since we, a decade and a half ago when EMRs got introduced and coders were enabled to work from home remotely and no longer physically from the hospital, that has presented new job opportunities for these coders who used to be landlocked in Little Rock, Arkansas. Well, now they can code for a hospital anywhere in the U.S. because they can do it remotely. And so what it's done is it's kind of nationalized, democratized wage rates across the country, right? It's no longer geographic. So that's kind of one point. And the vendors who are out trying to hire these people are offering very attractive packages, sign-on bonuses, education dollars, retention, you name it, right? So it makes it a real challenge.
Yeah, for sure. So to Michael's question, is there a better way? We certainly thought so, and we believe we have found a better way. And as we sort of set out our goals for for how we wanted to approach this, and as we were looking at ICD10, we first wanted to find a vendor partner who understood our challenges and understood, what we were up against in terms of, our, again, I talked about the complexity of BJC from rural critical access to academic. There's a lot of variety in there. Our needs really vary by hospital. We've got specialty of pediatric hospital, which is very unique. So we needed a vendor who could cover that waterfront and understood our challenges. We wanted someone that understood this vision that we were trying to create around a partnership. and that we wanted to do coding in a little different way than we've been operating, and really wanted someone that understood our goals around quality and productivity, finding the balance between those two things. So we were looking for someone who, kind of got us, right, who understood us. The third area would be really the size. We were using some very nice smaller vendors, but when we wanted a vendor who could provide us 60 coders, not 3 here and 4 from another and 10 from another. And so it became important to us that our vendor partner kind of mirrored us. We're a big, complicated organization. We were looking for an organization that was, another large organization. We were, again, when we started this, we were, looking at ICD10, so we weren't certain, were we going to see a 40% decline? Are we going to see, a 15%? Were our coders all going to jump ship? I mean, there were all those unknowns, and so we at least wanted someone who'd be thinking with us about ICD10. And then finally, we're looking for value for our investment. As I said a moment ago, we didn't necessarily think we were going to save gobs of money because we'd already standardized contract and negotiated rates based on our size, but we certainly wanted that economic value. And then, I don't know if I mentioned it, but one of the things that were important to us too is the track record of whoever that we were working with. So we started down a path. We put together a pretty competitive process, and we did a request for proposal, a very detailed, Michael, you'll remember the pages and pages that we went through. I mean, I think that's, I'll talk about lessons learned later, but we did a really detailed RFP and sent it to lots of vendors. In retrospect, we probably should have done a scaled back kind of how can you make it to the first hurdle with us? And so we probably didn't have to ask every vendor every question. Our finalists, we needed to know all those things, but we put a lot of vendors through a lot of work. We brought together a group of HIM leaders across BJC, so we had a big selection team. We were sort of supported by our supply chain colleagues at BJC, but we had a big team that we worked together. So I think I covered many of these things, but we were looking for someone that would understand us and our culture and what we were looking for, somebody that cared about quality like we did. We wanted that partner. We had really identified how much time we were spending on managing all those contract coders, so we wanted a partner that had that kind of infrastructure that could help manage our coders. We wanted them, our partner, to do quality assurance. Not that we wouldn't look at quality as well, but we wanted our partner to be managing their quality just like we were trying to manage ours. We wanted resources to educate and develop coders, and this was a big thing for us, is that when we were onboarding new coders, we wanted our partner to know how to onboard to BJC, what was unique about, and again, like I said, it wasn't just BJC, sometimes it's hospital by hospital, and so we wanted that partnership and the resources really to bring those coders in. And then, again, I think like any partnership, we wanted to be in it together. So we wanted to have kind of our incentives aligned. And so we did things that, the more coders we had, the better, the price break was, and things like that, so that we were incented to use Imagine, and Imagine was incented to provide us coders.
Right, absolutely.
So I think that was an important point.
Yeah, so, the things Tracy articulated, we've heard, parts of that from other hospitals along the way. The same challenges we heard with multiple vendors and getting people just in time, the availability. Do they come across trained? Do they understand the unique aspects of every hospital within a system? And so all hospitals were kind of challenged from that perspective. But we did spend a fair amount of time jointly kind of developing a vision for where this was going to go, and really wanting to model our approach to meet the expectations of folks like Tracy and BJC, and that was really helpful. So when we were finally, I guess from a timing perspective, we were kind of tentatively selected based on the outcome of a real planning session to get down to the nuts and bolts of how we were going to make this work, and then we were officially selected for the role And what we ended up doing was, having a number of, planning meetings with BJC leadership teams.
And Michael, I would just add, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
I think that was a pretty important key for us, is that we did, we started with a big number of vendors. We narrowed that down to a group of finalists that came in, and we spent time together and, sort of did that whole kind of dog and pony thing. But then we were getting, more and more comfortable with Imagine, and I will say Imagine hadn't been one of our vendors in the past, so we didn't have a lot of history. And so we spent a lot of time, dialoguing together about what this might look like, what was important. And while we had a vision, one of the things that what I found was important was that we were somewhat creating this together. It wasn't, you had ideas about what the partnership would look like. I had ideas. Terry, our HIM leader, and so it really evolved over time. And I think that's something that really, I think that has served us well now that we've been working together for so long, is that we spent all that, and I'm sure at the time it probably made you crazy because we spent a lot of time planning and preparing before we had a signature on a contract.
Yeah, but it was beneficial. I mean, I think that collaboration, that developing it jointly was really the essence to the success I think we've had to date, and candidly, I'd rather be in that situation with every client engagement versus a very rigid, structured RFP, answer these questions, someone behind the curtain is going to put a score on it, and you never get to dialogue with anyone, and then you get picked based on a number, and that's, again, not always the best way to get the best choice in the marketplace, and until you can engage in that dialogue. So, all the things you mentioned, we heard. So when we developed the model and implemented the program, the very first thing we did was we assigned it to one of our regional coding directors, who had responsibility for BJC along with some other large clients. We then hired a coding manager, and the very first things they did were to go in. We sent an advanced team in, and what they did was learned all of the BJC ways of doing business. As Tracey described, it's different Children's from Missouri Baptist versus Barnes Jewish versus Boone Hospital out in Columbia, Missouri. And so, there were very different approaches. The systems were different. They had been still going through conversions. So, and Barnes Jewish, they use multiple systems for imaging or, patient folder, and then we're, transitioning over to Sorian. So, understanding all of those systems, the processes, building a relationship with the people within the hospital, and then converting all that into knowledge that can then be transferred to our staff. And that became a key part of the success through that onboarding process of those coders, so they knew what the expectations were. The supervisors and leads that we put in place understood what the expectations were, and they were all aligned with what BJC was looking for. That enabled us to bring on, from the start of the program, within roughly about a 90-day period, we were able to bring on 35 coders into production. Has grown substantially since then, but one of the things that we do and did from the beginning was a comprehensive audit approach. Every coder received 100% pre-bill audit until they hit a certain quality level and productivity level, and then we would back off and do more periodic audits of the work that they do. But every new coder that comes on goes through that same kind of rigorous review. And then the other thing that we would do is, and we still do today, are the quarterly business reviews, where we look at all the metrics. We sit down with Tracey's team within HIM, our regional coding director, the coding manager, and they go through all the key metrics to make sure that we're doing what we said we were going to go do, holding us accountable to the promises we made. And through that contracting process, we signed up for, as Tracey said, put some skin in the game. We signed up for very specific productivity and quality metrics, and our reimbursement is tied to achieving those. So, what was the, kind of the result is, a more fully integrated leadership team.
And that's really, I think, that leadership team, that's kind of where I generally start when I think about kind of the successes. Our supervisors, when I say our supervisors, I'm talking BJC and Imagine, they have a daily huddle where they talk about workflow and what's going on. And so I would say if Terry Eichelman, our HIM director, she feels like she's got a much bigger team, right? So we've got this daily huddle that the supervisors do. The leaders above that, they have regular weekly or biweekly leadership meetings. So it's very integrated. We've got 5 FTEs who manage these coders and auditors, and so again, we don't manage this like totally separate teams, right? We have the same expectations for the Imagine coders as we do as the BJC coders. Those supervisors, whether they're a BJC supervisor or an Imagine supervisor, they're working together, and we're working together on workflow and planning and so forth. The training has been, Michael described that as before we got started, they sent folks on site to understand those unique needs so that the coders can be onboarded productively. And that benefits both of us, I would say, because it helps those Imagine coders be more productive, more successful. If we don't, and it's true of BJC employees and Imagine employees, if we don't do a good job onboarding, if we don't train them, they're not going to be successful. That's an expensive proposition, right? So we've got to replace them and so forth. So that training, I think, has been key. The other thing, from a quality and productivity perspective, and I've got some data here that I'll share with you, but the thing there is, I think we feel very confident with Imagine that they're monitoring quality and productivity the way we do, and they're paying attention to it the way we do, and we're acting on it the way we do. So it really is very, you certainly don't have a sense of this is lip service, if you will. And from my perspective, and I'm not as involved on a day-to-day basis, but I have much more peace of mind today than I did 2 years ago. Now, part of that is we've made it through ICD10 and the world didn't, come unglued. But nonetheless, I think we have, it's a different kind of arrangement, and it does certainly give me more peace of mind. To say just a little bit more about quality, so we have these quality standards in our contract of 95% accuracy, and we sometimes divide the world between our academic hospitals and our community, even though our community hospitals is a broad array. That's where our kind of rural critical access, as well as our big complicated community hospitals. But you can see, regardless of the hospital type, and over time they're meeting those goals. And again, for those of you who are also at academic centers, you just know the complexity of those. It's very high acuity. It's sort of a lot of unique cases, right? Whether it's a very complex transplant or whatever. So that's why we tend to we look at that quality by academic and community, and we are also very careful about what coders wind up in which area. So the thing that we feel good about quality, again, is that we know Imagine is doing regular quality audits. They're reacting to them. What we found in the past is we might find a coder that we had concerns about the quality, and the vendor was great to say, okay, well, let me go do an audit, let me see. They would react to any information. But I think what's important in the partnership is that Imagine is coming to us saying, we've got a concern about a coder. If that's the case, here's our action plan. Here's what we're going to do about it. So it's just a different, again, it feels like not so much the kind of vendor-client relationship, even though certainly it is.
Yeah, and when you're in it together, it's, we kind of both recognize that not every coder is going to be perfect, no matter what we do to screen them out, right, along the way. And it's not an embarrassment to turn to your client and say, this particular coder, through a lot of coaching and development, in our estimation, isn't going to get there, so we want to trade them out. And as long as we make sure that we consistently produce the same number of charts, and that BJC doesn't have to suffer from that, because that's part of the value of the outsource, right? If it's my employee, I own that decline in productivity. I own that issue. When I outsource it to someone, I don't want to own that problem anymore. I want that to be your problem, and it is our problem, right? So, so we do own that, and we sign up for that, and that's one of the, I think, values in that particular type of relationship.
And productivity is much, kind of much the same story. We've got productivity standards by the type, whether it's inpatient, ambulatory, and those kind of, some of that's BJC speak there. But the point is we have very specific productivity standards by the type of work they're doing, whether it's sort of the complex outpatient, more simple outpatient, inpatient, and the like. And so what we see is, again, Imagine is using the same productivity reports we use. We're reacting to those, and so we're all comparing, sort of using the same benchmark, if you will, and the same data to make decisions. And so it's more, again, we feel good about, we're not having to go to them to say, hey, you've got a coder who's not doing so well. They're they're managing and monitoring that with us, with their leadership team. So one of the things Michael asked me to think about is, looking back now, we've been on this journey together for some time, so, kind of what advice or what are some of the takeaways? And, I think planning that transition carefully is important. So some of the things that we did is the very, detailed RFP process. Again, there's things we could have done better or different about that. We had lots of people engaged. We had lots of dialogue. So, planning for that carefully is important, just as planning that transition. So we went, from 7 to 9 vendors supplying those coders. So it wasn't like we could overnight, replace 50 coders. Now, Michael described that process and moved pretty quickly. Would you say 90 days? The first 35. But we recognized this wasn't something that we were going to do overnight, and that we had to plan accordingly. I've talked a lot about this, is treating our partner as an extension of our team. So again, I think those daily huddles, those joint leadership meetings, that kind of thing really makes a difference. From an accountability, in a partnership, it's not just all about what have you done for me today, or vice versa, right. Candidly, right? We really work on this together, and that makes a big difference. And then I would guess that, in that selection process, selecting that vendor that has that cultural fit. One of the things that I value a lot personally is both a vendor who listens to me and tries to react, but also someone who brings something to me that I haven't thought of. Here's a new idea, another way to think about it. How about if we did that? And so for me, that may not be as important to everybody, but when I think about cultural fit, that's sort of what I'm thinking about is that we're going to continue advancing this model. What we're doing today may not be quite what we're doing a year from now. I think we'll continue to enhance it. So we'll both be looking for ways to do things even better.
Yeah. On that point about accountability being reciprocal is really important. And a great example of that is, we both had a vested interest in wanting to get people onboarded as quickly as we could. And trying to get through the maze of IT in a hospital, as everyone knows, can be challenging. There's a lot of different priorities, but just things as simple as getting people a login and a password to get access to the various systems. And in certain parts of BJC, there's multiple systems you have to get into. And one of the things that we did really successfully is Terry kind of took the lead on getting together with BJC IT and our IT and really mapping out a process that streamlined the number of days it took to get somebody system access, and we've shrunk that down from literally weeks into what's now, kind of within a week time frame, and that's helped a lot in terms of being able to move people in and out quickly. So that's that collaborative approach and that reciprocal accountability to results. And I guess, Kyle, before you get to the Q&A, the last, comment I would make, because I think, Tracy provided some really good, insight into the things to consider. These things that you invest in on the front end cost real money. And, we've really kind of shifted, to use an overused word, we've shifted the paradigm. I described earlier how hospitals use multiple vendors. They put a work order out there. Everyone scurries to get resources. They don't know what the defined term is going to be, so they invest very little and they throw the coders over the fence, hope they're successful, and the hospital is left to manage those, good or bad. Well, the shifting of the paradigm was, we as the partner will make a big investment on the front end into the management, into the supervision, into QA, into the onboarding, the education, training, etc. Well, that's money being spent before there's revenue being generated. The reason we can do that comfortably is that we know as long as we perform to the expected level, that we're going to be there with X number of people over a long period of time. So it's a mutual commitment, kind of codified in a contract, and that allows the partnership to really take off in the direction that we wanted it to move. So with that, Kyle, you want to kind of open it up for questions and answers?
Definitely. All right. Before we jump into the question and answer segment of today's webcast, let's pause for a moment to give the members of the audience an opportunity to submit questions. So we'll be back in a few seconds.
Okay.
All right, guys. So to kick things off, first question here. I think this question would apply to Michael and to Tracy as well. So are all the outsourced coders, are they all based in the U.S., or is there a mixture of U.S. and international?
So at BJC, we don't do any offshore. All of the coders are U.S. based.
Okay. And Michael, do you want to go into detail in terms of?
Yeah, sure. No, happy to answer that question as well. All of our coders are full-time W-2 employees of the company, and they are all domestic. We don't have any offshore coders.
Excellent. All right, let's move on to the next one. This is for Tracy. Tracy, were you able to receive and price concessions from Imagine, given your commitment to a minimum volume of coders?
Well, not as much as I wanted, but we did set up. Sorry, Michael. We did set up our pricing, and this was really, I think, to protect both of us, I guess, if you will, which is that given so for X to Y coders, the pricing is this. As we brought on more coders, the pricing went down. So each tier, and there were kind of bands of FTEs. We also got some value-add services the more coders that we committed to, so the full-time coding manager, who's a very senior person that works with us. So we got both, I would say, reduced pricing, the more volume we added, but also more services.
Yep. And we have since modified that pricing, just to add on to that, post ICD10, we've recently just modified the pricing in a way that now it's still based on tiers of quantity, number of coders, and the more you have, the less you pay. But it's also broken down by coder type, so you in a more granular level, pro-fee, ED, ancillary services, inpatient community, inpatient academic, et cetera. So it becomes a little bit more complex pricing algorithm, but more to the advantage of, really kind of aligns us better. I think it's to the client's advantage, so you're not paying the same rate across the board for every coder type, because candidly, they don't cost as much, right? I mean, we pay a lot more for, it's really hard to find good inpatient academic coders in the market, and you have to pay for them. So to the extent that you don't need as many of those, you don't have to pay as much across the board, right? So.
All right, on to the next one. Again, for Tracy, what lessons or what takeaways or advice do you have from the RFP process that eventually led you to selecting Imagine?
I think I mentioned a couple things. One, I think we made it too complicated early on, so we knew we wanted to include all of our existing vendors, and then we wanted to meet new vendors too. So we sent that initial RFP out to a lot of vendors. I can't tell you the number right now, but probably 20 maybe.
Close to that, yeah.
And we asked every question we could think of that we would want to know before we'd select someone. And in retrospect, I wish I had asked, I'm making this number up, 10 or 15 sort of qualifying questions that would just get us to know enough that we wanted to have further discussion. So I feel a little badly, candidly, that I put 20 vendors through a very detailed, it's a lot of work to fill those out, and a whole lot of work to read it all. So it wasn't only the work of the vendors, filling all this out, then we had to codify all this information and, review all of it. So we did make the process a little bit harder on ourselves. But past that, I think the notion of, kind of casting the net broadly, talking to a lot of people, bringing in a smaller number for those face-to-face meetings was good, and then continuing the dialogue with our, kind of finalists as we got more and more comfortable. We really put time and investment into the process, and I think it paid off for us.
Awesome. And then in terms of the coders, the question here from the audience is, how long did training take in terms of on hospital systems? The example raised here was the EMR, but can you speak specifically to BJC and the systems that you need to train these coders on?
Yeah, that is a complicated question. Because we don't have a single clinical system, unlike a lot of places that have one clinical system, perhaps Epic as an example. We aren't in that spot. So our community hospitals use one EMR. Our academic hospitals use another. Now we are moving towards a standardized clinical system, which will make everyone's life easier. But even in the outpatient arena, access to different systems, especially I'm thinking about some of the more complicated outpatients, where coders had to go into some different systems to access information. Most all of our hospitals are on McKesson patient folders, MPF, that's our post-discharge electronic medical record. So all these different clinical systems feed into MPF. That's what the coders use both to code from. That's what drives workflow. So we have queues that are set up that flow to the right kind of coder based on the work type. So, up until several months ago, our large academic hospital wasn't on that system. So the onboarding looked different at a community hospital that used MPF than it did at an academic hospital that wasn't. And so Michael, I don't know if you guys have a sense of the timing of the onboarding, but we start with the system access and get that, and then we go through, so the coders have to learn, they have to learn MPF, they have to learn the workflow.
Yeah, generally speaking, a coder is probably spending at least the first 2 weeks in just pure training before they ever start to produce charts, and then when they start to produce charts, all those charts are 100%, I mentioned earlier, 100% pre-bill audited prior to then backing off into a normal cadence, but they've got to hit the 95% and they have to hit certain productivity ramp. That normally takes, and depending on the facility, that could be a 45-day time period. It could be as long as 90 days in some of the more complex settings like BJH with the multitude of systems and the complexity of the cases. And these are for coders that come to us with that level of experience. But we've also, as you know, partnered with you to bring in brand new coders, or less experienced coders with 1 to 3 years of experience, and we put them through a fairly rigorous 90-day program as well, and so they're not coding at all during the first 30 days, and then they ramp up. They're doing like 50% coding during the next 30 until they get to the full productivity ramp 90 days later. So it kind of varies based on where we hire the person from, what kind of experience they come with, highly experienced to less experienced, and we never take the less experienced and put them into a very complex environment. Typically they're doing outpatient in the in the community setting.
But Michael, I think that's a good example of this kind of I don't know what we call it, the program where you're bringing in coders with less experience. We work together to design that
program
to get coders more experience, and so it benefited both of us because it allowed you to bring in a different profile of a coder. You could, they could learn through BJC. We were getting coding done, so it was kind of a good partnership of a different thing that you would do, than we've done in the past.
Right, and the idea being that we can kind of jointly grow coders over time, because it is so hard to find those, really skilled coders for the complex chart types. But if we can start to bring people into the organization over a longer period of time, train them up to do complex inpatient, one, we all pay less money for that. We get a lot of stickiness out of those people because they're really loyal, because we've created an opportunity and a career path, and it works well for both you and me.
Excellent. Follow-up to an earlier question about the RFP process for Tracy. How long did that entire process take?
Oh, goodness.
I think you started it in the fall of 2014, because I remember vividly a day in my temporary office. Anyway, that's how I remember it. But it was kind of probably the fall of 2014, and I think we signed a contract in summer of 2015.
No, so I'm going to believe you because I can't remember. I think I block out some of that stuff. But one of the things that we also did that was a little bit unique is that we, I talked about we had a standard contract and kind of a standard approach with our other vendors. We actually started using Imagine in kind of our old model as one of those 7 to 9 vendors.
Right.
We started using Imagine because we wanted to start working with them more as we worked out the details of this kind of new model and the tiered pricing and how much, what our staffing needs were going to be. So we started working together more quickly, but
Absolutely.
It was sort of a unique way that we eased. But I think it gave it certainly gave my team more comfort of starting to work with Imagine in the way that we were working with other coding companies, and so that helped with our transition.
Yeah, I think the RFP, from the time the RFP was initially sent through management, through presentations to that point where you kind of finally made a decision was probably around a 90-day time period. The rest of that time, as you said, was, we were already now working with you. You got to kind of see how we performed, candidly, right, before you kind of inked the deal. And then the rest of that time prior to signing the contract was us all figuring out, kind of collaboratively what we wanted this to ultimately look like, what the ramp-up was going to be, et cetera.
And there's the whole process of getting contracts signed, which is not the easiest thing in the world at BJC or most big organizations, so.
Excellent. And then I think we have time for one more question here. And Tracy, this one is for you as well. So how do you view your partnership with Imagine? We're just touching on it, but now that we're 8 months post ICD10 go live.
Yeah. So I would say it's like any partnership, any marriage, anything, there are going to be some bumps in the road. But I think the great thing about the way we've structured this is that, A, there haven't been big bumps in the road, right? B, we have a kind of very open dialogue with joint management that if we've got an issue, we deal with it. And so I feel very positive about it, or I probably wouldn't be doing this webinar with Michael. But I think you have to be realistic about realistic. And I think by entering the agreement, which you say we're going to figure this out over time, that helps you get through whenever there's if there's a bump in the road. And I don't have any great examples of that, but it's just. This is complicated stuff that we're doing, right? It's a hard job. They're hard to find. We have a lot of needs. We're going through ICD10. So I'm really thankful, though, that we did the whole RFP and got the model going before ICD10, because I think that really supported our ICD10 transition, which went remarkably well. And I think that's true for the industry, I suppose, but I think it certainly was very different than my worst nightmares a few years ago.
Yeah, right. And, there's so many other benefits. I was going to say, just add real quickly, there's so many other benefits to having that type of a trusted and embedded relationship. There have been other, situations where, BJC has needed some just interim help, whether it's, doing an MPI cleanup free Saurian conversion at one of their hospitals, or, they did a big transcription project, which is not work that we do. And, during that project, one of their key employees, the spouse transferred and they moved out of state, and BJC can't employ him out of state, so we employ him and then rent him back at cost. And, there's a lot of things that we can do that, that we do in the name of the partnership, and you do that when you have kind of a long-term trusted relationship. Excellent. With that, we conclude today's presentation, and with it a special thanks to our speakers as well as our sponsor, Imagine. And for the latest in revenue cycle management, billing, and reimbursement, visit RevCycleIntelligence.com. Thank you, and have a great day. Thank you all.